When you think of a trade war, you probably think of cars or steel, right? Maybe lumber. But what if I told you that in 2025, one of the biggest economic showdowns between the US and Canada wasn't about any of that? Nope. It was about something we all make every single day and try our best not to think about: our trash. This is the wild story of how millions of tons of garbage got caught right in the middle of a massive political fight. So to really get what happened, you have to understand the before times. Before all the drama, there was this massive, non-stop river of trash flowing across the border. And I mean that literally. Every day, an invisible highway of trucks would haul garbage from Ontario, Canada's biggest province, straight into Michigan. This wasn't some small-time operation. It was a huge piece of how Ontario dealt with its waste. And just how much are we talking about here? Well, get a load of this. In a single year, Ontario shipped out a whopping 3.44 million tons of waste to the United States. That's more than a quarter of all the trash the entire province sent to a landfill. It just shows you how deeply dependent Ontario had become on its neighbor to the south. Now, flip the coin and look at it from Michigan's perspective. The numbers are just as wild. Almost 1 out of every 5 truckloads of garbage getting dumped in Michigan wasn't even from Michigan. And where was most of it coming from? Not Ohio, not Indiana, but Canada by a long shot. So you gotta ask, why Michigan? What made it the go-to spot? Well, it boils down to something really simple. It was dirt cheap. Michigan was charging a rock-bottom landfill fee of just 36 cents per ton. I mean, compare that to Ohio at almost $5 or Wisconsin at $13 a ton. For the big waste companies, it was a no-brainer. It was literally cheaper to truck Ontario's trash for hours just to dump it in Michigan. And then, bam, in early 2025, this whole arrangement just got blown to pieces. The Trump administration slammed down a whole new set of tariffs. And in doing that, it completely changed the game. All of a sudden, everyday garbage wasn't just garbage anymore. It was officially a taxable international good. And just like that, a massive tariff wall went up. And things moved fast. On February 1st, the tariffs hit. Less than 2 weeks later, the administration was calling for reciprocal tariffs on pretty much anyone they thought was being unfair. By April, the companies caught in the crossfire were already suing, setting the stage for a huge legal showdown. Now, here's the really interesting legal part. To do this, the administration didn't use a normal trade law from Congress. Instead, they reached for this thing called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. It's a law from 1977 that was meant for genuine national emergencies. The argument they made was that cross-border trafficking was a national emergency, and that gave them the power to slap a 25% tariff on Canadian goods, including, you guessed it, trash. The fallout was, well, it was immediate and it was messy. This tariff wall kicked off what people started calling the garbage wars. For Ontario, it was a 5-alarm fire, a total crisis. But for some politicians in Michigan who had been complaining for years about being Canada's trash can, it looked like a golden opportunity. See, for years, experts had been warning that Ontario was heading for a waste cliff. The province just wasn't building enough new landfills to handle its own garbage. The trade war basically took this slow-moving problem and lit a fire under it. If the U.S. border shut down for good, Ontario's landfills would be completely full by 2034. We're talking about an existential sanitation crisis. Meanwhile, back in Michigan, Governor Gretchen Whitmer's administration saw their chance. They proposed a huge policy change: jack up the state's landfill fee from that tiny 36 cents a ton all the way to $5. That's more than 1,000% increase. The message was loud and clear: the party's over. Michigan wasn't going to be the cheap dumping ground anymore. Okay, but just when you think this is a simple story about regular trash heading south, the plot takes a major turn. Because at the same time, there was another, much quieter stream of waste going the other way. A much more dangerous stream of hazardous, toxic waste flowing north, from the US into Canada. And this was the waste corridor that nobody really wanted to talk about. The anger over this really bubbled up, and it was perfectly captured by Ruba Gazal, a member of parliament in Quebec. She just came out and said it: "We are not the trash can of the United States." And as this trade war heated up, a movement for environmental sovereignty really started to catch on. I mean, think about it. The idea that Canada was getting hit with tariffs on its regular garbage while simultaneously importing toxic American waste, it just felt fundamentally wrong to a lot of people. And this wasn't just a feeling, you know? The numbers were stark. In just 1 year, A single landfill in Quebec took in over 5,000 tons of contaminated soil and 28,000 tons of other hazardous stuff. We're talking cyanide, mercury, nitric acid, all of it from the United States. So when the American company that owned the place tried to expand, protests erupted. It became a huge flashpoint. So you've got this economic chaos, you've got a landfill crisis brewing in Ontario, you've got toxic waste protests in Quebec. All of this tension, all of these different fights were all building toward one single moment. A high-stakes legal battle that would go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and decide the fate of the entire tariff system. The case was called Learning Resources, Inc. versus Trump. And it really all came down to one incredibly important question. Does this law, the IEPA, this act designed for national emergencies, actually give the president the power to invent and impose taxes, in this case tariffs, all by himself? Or is that power something that only Congress can use? And on February 20th, 2026, the court gave its answer. In a 6-3 decision, they ruled no. The IREPA does not give the president the authority to impose tariffs. They basically reaffirmed a core principle of the Constitution. The power to tax, to lay and collect duties, belongs to Congress, and Congress alone. The financial impact of that one ruling was just astronomical. By the time the decision came down, the government had collected an estimated $142 billion from these now illegal tariffs in 2025. That's billion with a B. All the importers who had paid those fees were now looking at the government, hands out, ready to start the long, complicated process of getting their money back. But it's never that simple, right? The Supreme Court's ruling didn't just magically turn back the clock. You can't just flip a switch and go back to normal. The year of disruption had been too big, too profound. It permanently changed the way both countries thought about trade, supply chains, and especially waste. The hours and days right after the ruling were just a whirlwind. The Supreme Court says the tariffs are illegal. So what happens? The Trump administration pivots almost immediately and announces new global tariffs under a completely different law. Meanwhile, the big waste haulers like GFL Environmental, they'd spent a year dealing with all this uncertainty. So they just took all their increased costs and passed them right down the line to cities, to businesses, and eventually to us, the taxpayers. So when the dust settled, what was the new normal? What really changed for good? Well, a few big things. The whole crisis forced Ontario to finally get serious about its waste cliff and fast-track its own landfill projects. That debate in Michigan about raising fees, it suddenly had a whole new sense of urgency. And more broadly, the whole idea of environmental sovereignty became a real political force in Canada. But maybe the biggest lesson of all was just how fragile these cross-border supply chains we depend on every day really are. Which really leaves us with one final, pretty big thought. The flow of garbage across a border, it's a hidden system, an invisible connection we all rely on but almost never think about. And if a fight over something as basic as trash can cause this much chaos and disrupt two entire nations, it really makes you wonder, what other invisible connections are out there? What other fragile systems that underpin our daily lives are just one political decision away from breaking?